And open the meeting. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to announce that 80% of us who want to continue to be members have paid their dues. So the rest of you, if you're interested, please do so quickly so Kelly can get that on the books with International. We've got some anniversaries to celebrate. 48 years for past President Jay Brill, 43 years for Mark Varnow, 31 years for John Frank and Austin Green, and today, Trent Cowles, 24 years with the club. We can't do it without you. Next week, we don't have a meeting, but we do have, if you recall, we started monthly socials. So again, we'll do the third Monday. Roger is doing IOZOs, and then we're starting a supper club. And we're going to rotate probably the days of the week as well as the locations. So this coming Tuesday, the 24th, will be at Cooper's Hawk on 96th and Keystone at 5:30. I need you to RSVP to me, either email or text. If you're coming or not, bring a spouse and significant other, a potential club member. It's a social hour, bring whoever you like. Just let me know how many are coming. As you know, we give away $5,000 grants through the Kiwanis Foundation. And if you're interested in reviewing those grants, those grant applications and coming to a decision, which of the 50 right now will get one of the 10 grants, let Kelly know and she can get you that grant information. In the past, we've given $210,000 to 53 organizations through this foundation grant. So it's definitely a worthwhile cause.
Susie, time to go out.
And this year we're giving $5,000 grants instead of $2,500 grants. So November 2nd is we will have a 23-year-old composer and filmmaker from Carmel, Ashton Gleckman. His work includes Heartland Film Festival award-winning documentary We Shall Not Die Now and Kennedy, which debuts on the History Channel on November 18th. So that's, mark your calendars for November 2nd. And then on November 30th, we have Doug Carter, who is the superintendent of this Indiana State Police. He's been in the news lately. You recall, regarding the issues with the justice system here in Indiana. Riley has invited us to a special screening of Racing to Respond at Gainbridge Fieldhouse Monday, November 20th. It's about pediatric mental health crisis. And if you were at our meeting last week, Mel Sexton gave us a great overview of the initiatives and how Kiwanis can help. They're looking at childhood mental health issues very differently than they used to, and how to treat it and nip it in the bud, correct it, identify it, etc. So that should be very interesting. November 7th, Colts Gridiron Hall for the 67th Annual Marion County High School Football Awards. We're presenting $5,000 scholarships and honoring players and coaches. Also in November, Salvation Army, November 13th through the 17th, we'll be doing Angel Tree Toy Shop donation drop-off. And you can volunteer. All volunteers are welcome. This is a great thing to do with your families, to get your kids involved. We'll also have, because we've got such a great relationship with the Salvation Army, we'll have news shortly about bell ringing, or as we call ourselves, the dinglings, how you can sign up for that. And we've dropped a picture of our new sponsored Key Club at Shortridge High School onto the Indiana District Rally last week at the Indianapolis Zoo. We provide a grant that supports their leadership. So, Pat, is Pat on yet? Pat McCrory? I don't think she's on. Well, then I will be glad to invite Jeremy Wesley, Director of Grants and Fundraising Data with Christel House, to provide a recap of the 2021 $2,500 Kiwanis Foundation grant for the preschool enrichment program at the drop-in daycare at Christel House. Jeremy, you're up. You might be on mute. Can you unmute, Jeremy?
There we go.
There you go.
Sorry, I was having problems getting to my mute. Thank you, Kiwanis Foundation of Indianapolis, for this grant to support our Doors drop-in daycare programming at our Manual campus, which is located where the Henriques Manual High School used to be. One of the most powerful outcomes of the drop-in daycare center has been the opportunity it has provided to a multi-generational school experience for families, fostering the love of learning from infancy through adulthood. The daycare program has also been monumental in removing barriers that once prevented our adult students with young children from being able to realize their dreams of earning a high school diploma. Parents are able to attend classes with the security of knowing that their children are being cared for by nurturing, well-trained staff just a few steps away. Muriari, a new mom studying at the high school, said that the daycare center makes it easier for her to pursue her education goals. And she wants to encourage mothers who have children to take advantage of the services provided through Doors at Manual to be able to gain their high school diploma. Likewise, Anna, an English as a second language student at Doors, says that it helps her to be calm knowing that her daughter is with people who will take good care of her, and that makes her mind a little freer. It gives her the space to learn English with that peace of mind. So I just want to thank you all again for helping to make this critical program possible for our Doors families.
Thank you, Jeremy. The Christel House does such good work, and we are so fortunate that we have this foundation that we're able to help you facilitate the successes that you're continuing to have with young children and their parents. So thank you again for taking the time to come and share with us what you're doing. We appreciate everything that you and your team does at Christel House. Jeremy, or Graham, I'm going to turn it over to you now to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mary. We are really excited to have back Diana Henriques. You may recall she joined us earlier this year about the Madoff documentary and her role in that. And she has a brand new book out, and I am going to read her bio here. Diana is an award-winning Sorry, my screen has failed me here. She's an award-winning financial journalist, is the author of 6 books, as a staff writer for the New York Times from 1989 to 2012, and as a contributing writer since then. She has largely specialized in investigative reporting on white-collar crime, market regulation, and corporate governance. Born in Texas, but mostly raised in Roanoke, Virginia, she's Phi Beta Kappa graduate of what is now the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Again, if you weren't able to participate with us before, she talked about her New York Times bestseller, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. You can catch that on your YouTube channel, and we are really appreciative. She is returning to talk about her new book, which looks fascinating. And hopefully Kelly can put up the Amazon link, Taming the Street, the Old Guard, the New Deal, and FDR's Right to Regulate American Capitalism. Please consider ordering that book along with mine. I'm just joking. As an author, I can appreciate, it says, as an author, I can appreciate every review I get. And let me just read one from the Madoff documentary. This is historical storytelling at its best, with vivid characters, cinematic settings, and nonstop pacing. Diana brings to life a real-life political battle from the 1930s that is still deeply relevant almost a century later. It's a vital story, a rare instance when Washington faced down Wall Street's titans and summoned the courage to get it right. Publishers Weekly says Henriques makes the potentially dry subject of SEC regulation fascinating, and the vivid prose evokes the dynamic personalities involved. It is a skillful account of a pivotal era in America's economic history. With all that, let's give a virtual round of applause to Diana Henriques, who is back to talk about her new book. Diana?
Thank you, Gordon. I appreciate that. Especially appreciate that review. You're absolutely right. Hello to all of you who are joining me again, and anyone who might have missed my visit in April. To start, I'd like to take you back to the fall of 1932 with a brief passage from Taming the Street. Now, a bit of background at first. At the time, FDR was governor of New York. The passage is set in days when the stock exchanges had half-day sessions on Saturdays. It refers to the market upheaval that erupted when Britain went off the gold standard in 1931. And it mentions a man named Richard Whitney, who was the immensely powerful president of the New York Stock Exchange and a vocal supporter of President Hoover, FDR's opponent in the 1932 election. So here goes. On election day, November 8, 1932, Roosevelt carried all but 6 states in a landslide that expanded the Democrats' power in the House and Senate and swept FDR's lieutenant governor, Herbert H. Lehman, into the governor's chair in Albany. But the Constitution, in language already repealed for future elections, required Roosevelt to wait until Saturday, September 4th, 1933, to be sworn in. As he waited, the nation descended into the worst winter of the Depression. Parts of the Farm Belt were drying up and starting to blow away. Untold hosts of people were homeless or living in shacks made of tin scraps or old boxes. Photographs from the era show families scouring landfills for salvageable food or saleable goods. Private charities were exhausted. Churches, museums, colleges, men's lodges, women's clubs, and scout troops were all struggling as donations just dried up. A record number of businesses had failed that year. Those that survived had done so by cutting billions of workers off their payrolls. At least 25% of American workers, nearly 13 million people at a minimum, were unemployed. It is likely the national tally was much higher. Parenthetically, labor statistics were very crudely kept in that era. It is likely the national tally was much higher, but it is certain that the toll in some cities was higher still. Democracy itself was being tested. In November, the nation had overwhelmingly elected a man who promised to help, but his hands were tied for months. It seemed the social order had finally slipped off its axis on February 15, 1933. During a Miami evening rally, an assassin fired 5 shots at Roosevelt, who was spared when an alert woman bravely jostled the gunman's arm. As the assassin was wrestled to the ground, the president-elect hauled the nearby victim, the fatally wounded mayor of Chicago, into his limousine and held him in his arms as they sped to the hospital. Afterward, FDR seemed utterly himself. His only visible reaction was his concern for the mayor and the others who had been shot. One close aide recalled, "I have never in my life seen anything more magnificent than Roosevelt's calm on that night." There was worse still for the nation to endure before the inauguration. Days before FDR's miraculous escape, a major bank in Detroit, the hub of the nation's supposedly impregnable auto industry, had been hit with a run and was in danger of failing. A desperate Treasury official sought help from auto titan Henry Ford, warning him that the Detroit failure could be disastrous for the whole country. Ford refused. "Let the crash come," he said. And it did. A desperate Michigan governor and soon governors in nearly every other state closed their banks or severely restricted withdrawals. By the time Roosevelt boarded his train to Washington on Thursday, March 2nd, consumer spending had virtually stopped. By late Friday evening, March 3rd, when he went to bed in the suite on the 7th floor of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, only New York's mighty banks were still open. When he woke up on Saturday, they too were closed. Before dawn that morning, Governor Lehman had declared a 2-day bank holiday at the pleading of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. The moratorium would last days longer. Stocks can't be paid for if banks aren't open. Dick Whitney had no choice but to close the New York Stock Exchange. Before the opening bell on Saturday morning, March 4th, he climbed up to the podium over the trading floor and announced a 2-day closure, only the third in the exchange's history. 2 days would come and go, but as long as the banks were closed, the exchange would also remain shuttered. It must have been a bitter pill for the man who almost single-handedly had kept the exchange open through the 1929 crash and the 1931 gold crisis. The trading floor was hushed by his words. The tickers sent the news out across the country and fell silent. Like the great suffering nation, the world of Wall Street grew ominously quiet, waiting for Roosevelt. In Taming the Street, I let Franklin Roosevelt make the original case for why we need to regulate the world of finance, a world whose instincts remain as ruthless today, unfortunately, as they were when FDR first arrived in Washington in 1933. It is amazing to me that so few Americans today realize the key role that FDR's Wall Street regulations played in strengthening democracy and nurturing middle-class prosperity in the decades after the New Deal. Instead, both political parties for decades have increasingly argued that Uncle Sam should just leave America's financial markets alone. These advocates of deregulation claim we need to cut red tape and curb bureaucratic meddling. Politicians and a lot of citizens seem to see federal market regulation as a burden and not an asset. Their ideal is an unfettered, unregulated market free to maximize profits for investors. But here's the catch. None of the people preaching deregulation today has ever experienced an unregulated American market. Like all of us, they have lived their entire lives protected by financial rules put in place by FDR almost 90 years ago. They have no idea what a financial world would look like without a cop on Wall Street, how it would work, whom it would hurt, how deeply it would undermine the fundamental sense of fairness that is essential to democracy. But Franklin Roosevelt did know, because he had lived through the 1920s. Now, I've got to say, the Jazz Age has always gotten great press. Hire their publicist if you ever get the chance. Quoting myself here, quote, bootleg cocktails and raccoon coats, heroic aviators and long-limbed showgirls, the folksiness of comic Will Rogers, and the classiness of Broadway's Fred Astaire. Hollywood has given us this image of the Roaring '20s as a glittering golden age of seamless prosperity. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The wealth of that decade flowed almost entirely to the top 1% of Americans. The rest of the country, especially the working class, struggled to get by. Under 3 consecutive Republican presidents between 1921 and 1933, Washington basically let Wall Street decide how to behave. And by today's standards, it behaved like a criminal enterprise. Respected Wall Street insiders routinely manipulated stock prices. Widely admired bankers regularly used lies to sell stocks and foreign bonds that they knew were terrible investments. Financial titans formed Byzantine holding companies to squeeze cash out of utilities and banks. They cut secret deals riddled with conflicts of interest to claim the lion's share in corporate bankruptcies at the expense of small shareholders and creditors. They routinely traded on private information not available to average investors. They bought influence by, sadly, bribing journalists and by letting politicians purchase cut-rate shares in their richest deals. Most of that behavior was perfectly legal at the time. All of it was universally tolerated. Then in October 1929, which is where my chapter 1 starts, Americans watched in horror as an unregulated Wall Street collapsed. After a short-lived rebound in early 1930, the stock market began the grim decline of the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover tried to address the crisis with the tools of his conservative ideology, cheerleading for business, calling for private charity to step up to ease the suffering, enacting tax cuts for the wealthy, and counseling rugged individualism for everyone else. But those methods were tragically unequal to the devastation caused by an almost total collapse in consumer spending and a spiral of falling prices. By July 1932, the Dow Jones Index had fallen almost 90% from its September 1929 crest, as the nation's economy staggered almost to a halt. Every cog in the machine that a law-abiding, liberty-loving America relied on to earn its daily bread and maintain civil order seemed to have broken under the weight of the Great Depression. Communists infiltrated peaceful pro-labor demonstrations, hoping to provoke police violence that would feed workers' outrage. The captains of industry looked with growing admiration at the fascist leaders in Germany and Italy, who were dealing with their labor unions with deadly efficiency. The nation was balanced on a knife edge, ready to tip towards some dictatorial regime of the far left or the far right if democratic measures could not address the shattered economy. One story from that era captures how precarious this situation looked to those living through it. Soon after FDR was sworn in, a White House visitor supposedly told him that if he could cure the Depression, he would be our greatest president. But if he failed, he would be our worst president. Roosevelt corrected him. If he failed, he said, he would be our last president. By electing FDR and his New Deal, America was giving democracy one more chance to save the nation. And financial reform was the heart and soul of FDR's fight to do that. In later decades, and even to this day, some claim that FDR was deliberately vague about what the New Deal would entail, that he kept voters in the dark and won in 1932 simply because he wasn't Herbert Hoover. But that is simply wrong. Roosevelt ran on a platform that unequivocally called for government regulation of the financial markets, tighter rules for the nation's big banks and giant holding companies. He could not have been more explicit about his plans to regulate stock exchanges, beef up bank regulation, protect bank deposits, curb giant electric conglomerates, and protect ordinary Americans from being ripped off by big business. One close aide described FDR's political philosophy like this. He had, quote, a profound feeling for the underdog, a real sense of the crucial imbalance of economic life, a very keen awareness that political democracy could not exist side by side with economic plutocracy. So a vote for FDR in 1932 was a vote for an unprecedented change in the way Washington dealt with American capitalism and the way American capitalism dealt with the American people. Hoover knew it, Wall Street knew it, and the voters knew it. They elected Roosevelt specifically to transform the power balance between the plutocrats and the people. And he did. The laws he pushed through Congress required corporations to honestly disclose their finances to investors, regulated insider trading, and banned market manipulation. He set up the FDIC to protect depositors if banks failed, and he strengthened bank regulation so fewer banks would fail. The New Deal reformed how small creditors were treated in corporate bankruptcies, regulated America's mutual funds and investment advisors, and even laid the foundation for what became the NASDAQ market. We would not recognize today's financial world if these New Deal reforms had not been enacted, or maybe some of us would. It would look like the ruthless, unregulated landscape of the Jazz Age, minus the bootleg cocktails and raccoon coats. Dozens of people in government and on Wall Street played some role in the regulatory drama of the 1930s. But for clarity, I decided to tell the story through the eyes of 4 key characters, the most consequential figures in this unprecedented fight. The most prominent, of course, was FDR, a son of wealth and privilege, who came to champion the forgotten man, the ordinary Americans whose work long had been taken for granted and whose needs had been largely ignored by government and business. Or as FDR put it in his first inaugural address as governor of New York in January of 1929, he said, "Our civilization cannot endure unless we as individuals realize our personal responsibility to and dependence upon the rest of the world. For it is literally true that the, quote, self-supporting man or woman has become as extinct as the man of the Stone Age. Without the help of thousands of others, any one of us would die naked and starved." He noted that those thousands, quote, worked in sunlit fields, in dark mines, in the fierce heat of molten metal, and among the looms and wheels of countless factories to produce the food, clothing, and small luxuries of life enjoyed by others. In his view, it was simple fairness, not charity, to address the needs of those fellow citizens on whom so many depend. In my story, I also focus on 2 of FDR's most complex and yet effective allies in his fight to regulate Wall Street, Joseph P. Kennedy and William O. Douglas. Joe Kennedy was a chameleon, a supporter of the New Deal while still a brazen speculator on Wall Street. He had broken most of the rules he would later try to enforce. "It's easy to make money in this market," he had told a friend in the early 1920s. "We'd better get in before they pass a law against it." He grew rich as a market speculator and richer as a Hollywood deal maker. But as the Depression deepened, Kennedy came to see Franklin Roosevelt as the only man who could lead America's desperate fight to save itself. He put his money and his media connections to work to help elect FDR in 1932, in 1936, and again in 1940. But their relationship would shift and sour in the years that followed. If Kennedy was FDR's unreliable ally, William O. Douglas was the true blue sidekick who rode with him to the end of the trail. Douglas was a young Western-born law professor at Yale who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the corrupt bankruptcy process that served the powerful and slighted everyone else. As a New Dealer, Douglas shared FDR's contempt for Wall Street shenanigans. It was abrupt, sometimes abrasive, very young, but he put vigor and discipline into FDR's regulatory machinery. My fourth character is FDR's fiercest Wall Street adversary, Dick Whitney. Early in the 1929 crash, Richard Whitney had galvanized the market by striding from post to post on the stock exchange for loudly and confidently placing orders for tens of thousands of shares. Given Whitney's ties to J.P. Morgan, where his brother was a partner, his buying spree assured panicky traders that the big Wall Street bankers were going to save the market. It was far too little and much too late. But that brief rallying effort made Dick Whitney famous across the nation, literally overnight. He soon emerged as the natural candidate to lead the Wall Street Old Guard's fight against Roosevelt's New Deal, a fight that unfortunately continues to this day, one that will be shaped as much by next year's election as it was by the election of 1932. Excuse me. My hope is that Taming the Street will remind us today how much we have benefited as a nation from FDR's fight to tame the street, so that we can preserve those benefits for future generations. You can learn more about Taming the Street and read the first chapter for free by going to my website, dianabhenriques.com. That's dianabhenriques.com. And now I'm happy for my favorite part of the program, which is to take your questions and engage in conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to let Graham coordinate question and answers. I think you've hit this one out of the park again, just like the last one that you shared with us. Let's open it for questions. I see there's one in the message, new messages. Graham, you want to run with that? Take yourself off.
I'm seeing one here that the 1932 Democrat platform promised a balanced budget. According to IU history professor, isn't this inconsistent with what FDR did?
It isn't really. I'm very aware of that. I should say that I speak as someone who had read every single campaign speech and the newspaper coverage of those speeches during that 32 campaign. The Democratic platform called for a balanced budget, and FDR believed in a balanced budget when the emergency was over. He later said that to have balanced the budget in 1933 or 34 or even 35, when so many Americans were suffering, would have been a crime against humanity. That when America was suffering, the Democrats could not pass by on the other side, he said, evoking a biblical image. So I guess the quick answer is to say, yes, he promised a balanced budget, but he didn't say when. And indeed, he tried to achieve that balanced budget too soon in 1936 and early 37 and tipped the economy back into a recession in 1937, known as the Roosevelt recession, realized his error and dialed back the budget cuts. It's not well known, but Roosevelt had met and was in correspondence with John Maynard Keynes, the English economist, who was, of course, in Britain at the time, arguing for a fiscal stimulus to support the collapse of private sector spending. And Keynes was deeply disappointed in 36 when Roosevelt started saying, well, now it's time to balance the budget, because he was privately and quite correctly persuaded that the private sector economy was not yet strong enough. So that's what happened with respect to the balanced budget. But in every other regard with respect to his financial reforms, FDR was absolutely crystal clear. In fact, on a front page of a New York Times, after one of his speeches dealing with his plans to regulate public utility holding companies, there's a list, FDR's plans for holding companies, and it couldn't have been more specific. I quote from it in the book, but it got down to exactly what kind of information they were going to be required to disclose. So down into that kind of granular detail.
I've got a question. So regulating the SEC, getting it through Congress, were there things that he really wanted to get through on this that he couldn't get Congress to agree to?
That's a great question. And it certainly was a product of great compromise. The first big reforms that Roosevelt passed were passed in his famous 100 days. And there were, he got what he wanted in those bills, just about. The FDIC was one of the compromises he was forced to make. Roosevelt himself did not favor deposit insurance. He wanted to find quicker ways to liquefy frozen assets in banks when they failed, so that depositors could get their money back faster. But he worried about the moral hazard of deposit insurance, as some economists do today, and don't get me started on that argument. But he compromised to get the Glass-Steagall Act passed. He had to accept FDI insurance because Representative Steagall wasn't going to support the bill any other way. So there was that compromise. The other big compromise with respect to the SEC was what kind of agency it would be. The original plan in the Securities Act of 33 was to let the Federal Trade Commission regulate Wall Street. It was a big, and in those days, deeply powerful and widely respected regulatory agency. And it had done some extraordinary work in investigating the abuses of public utilities. And that's where FDR wanted the power to rest, was with the FTC. But in his own party, Senator Carter Glass of Virginia was deeply opposed to giving the FTC that additional power. And with support from Wall Street, this was one of Richard Whitney's little finagles in the creation of the SEC. Glass insisted on a separate commission. Now, Richard Whitney, of course, said, oh, fine, a brand new little agency that we can capture right away. But when Roosevelt assured Sam Rayburn, who was the powerful Democrat in the House who was getting these bills through Congress, Roosevelt assured him that Wall Street would not dictate the choices he made to the commission, the people he put on the commission, and that they would be genuine regulators and watchdogs. Rayburn finally gave in and accepted Carter Glass's plan for a separate freestanding 5-member commission to be called the Securities and Exchange Commission. Little known fact, the law that creates it is called the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The agency is called the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, and don't ask me why. But there were the biggest compromise was to deny the SEC criminal enforcement power. Besides not putting it in the FTC, to deny the young agency the right to bring criminal charges on its own. It would forever have to work through the Department of Justice to bring criminal charges. It had widespread powers in other areas to impose financial sanctions, to lift licenses, to bar people from the industry, to block the sales of specific securities and industries, but it was never given the criminal enforcement powers. And that was perhaps, looking back, the key compromise. And interestingly, it did not loom large in the debate and coverage at the time. Many newspapers paid no attention to it at all.
Wow.
Other questions? Diana, I'd like to ask, how did this book differ from your previous works in terms of amount of research, time? technique, anything you can comment there?
Well, it was a nightmare. I mean, it's a story, Graham, that I'd wanted to tell for a long, long time. I had first learned about the story of Richard Whitney when I was a baby Wall Street reporter back in the 1980s. There's a wonderful old I was going to say out of print book, but I believe it might have been brought back in paperback, called Once in Golconda by the writer John Brooks, the late John Brooks. He was a wonderful financial writer for the New Yorker for many decades. And he had collected a lot of little episodic stories from the 1920s and 30s at a time when a lot of the people who lived them were still alive, and he was able to interview them. So I knew he was drawing on firsthand actual memories of what had happened during those days. And he devoted some of that book to Richard Whitney's story, nowhere near as much as I wanted to hear, but I just thought it was a fascinating piece of financial history. And so that kind of stuck in my head. And then I learned more about William O. Douglas and his role as the third chairman of the SEC and the most consequential chairman in its history, without a doubt. He, of course, went on to become the longest serving Supreme Court justice in our history. So, all right, well, maybe we talk about Bill Douglas and Dick Whitney, not quite sure. But somewhere along the way, with guidance from editors and friends, I began to see a hole in the FDR bookshelf. And that seems insane because there are 55 gazillion books on Franklin Roosevelt. But I can tell you, none of them focus exclusively on his financial reforms and how they came about. In fact, if you go to some of these great big biographies I've got here on my desk, big fat ones like this, and look up SEC in the index, maybe 1, 2, 3, sometimes no entries at all for the Securities and Exchange Commission, only one of his greatest financial reforms. So I began to see more clearly that this wasn't just a fun tale about, people in Wall Street in the Jazz Age. It was a hole in our understanding of the New Deal. It was a hole in our understanding of Roosevelt's priorities and the impact he had on the nation for nearly a century to come. So that changed the direction of the book. This all took time. A small medical crisis in my husband's life, which required us to move, took more time. And by the time I'm ready to really get down and dig into this marvelous archival research, the pandemic hit and closed all the archives. So I became a very quick study in tracking down out-of-print books published in the 1930s, many of which are on those bookcases right there behind me. Newspapers.com, priceless resource. The New York Times archives, priceless resource. The SEC Historical Society, God bless them. I write big checks every year. They run an entirely digital online museum of SEC history. And you can go to sechistorical.org. It's the SEC Historical Society.org online and find old photographs from the 20s and 30s and 40s, documents, letters, notes, telegrams, speeches, all sorts of wonderful material that I was able to use to supplement my book research. So my biggest find, and was the most expensive book I've ever bought in my life, which I will now get. It's this. One of the most challenging parts of the story to tell was the fall of Richard Whitney. And it was documented in SEC hearings held in 1938 and available in the clunkiest imaginable digitized form online. I kept trying to use it and was just just in despair, head down on my desk, weeping kind of stuff. Started looking to see if I could find them. And somewhere online, I found this 4-inch compendium. All it is the original government printing office volumes of the Whitney hearings, pasted together and slapped between hard covers. There's no printer identified for it. It's the only copy I've ever been able to find, and it cost me $500. Cheap at 3 times the price, let me tell you. It is my treasure because it allowed me to quote people directly. One of the most challenging things about writing nonfiction is dialogue. I don't make it up. If I don't have a letter, a speech, a telegram, a transcript, something that allows me to put specific words in somebody's mouth, I don't. So when the archives closed, all those letters and notes and notebooks and diaries and journals that I was dreaming of using, up in smoke. So this was a godsend. So it was a very different sort of research than I expected it would be when I started the project. But ultimately, it was fun. I mean, it was like a treasure hunt. It was like a puzzle, tracking down a book on the Public Utility Holding Company Act published in 1936. Well, where are we going to find that baby? Well, it's on my shelf right now. So it was fun. And then, to be honest, the telling of it never seemed to be the challenge. I honestly don't remember when I decided to focus just on those 4 men. I know I did. I made that decision at some point along the way, and when I made it, everything fit. Everything I wanted to cover and felt needed to be in the arc of the story all fit. But I don't remember specifically making that decision or how to do it. But I will say this, it's my favorite book of the 6 I've written. I think I was able to put to use a lot of the lessons I learned working with the screenwriters on the Madoff movie, the HBO movie. And sort of, I had more time to work on the writing of it, so I think it's a little more polished. Of course, there are still things I would change. I read through it. As soon as I got the hardcover book, I read through it and said, oh no, I could have taken out that sentence. But all told, I'm really very, very pleased with how it turned out. And I will also give credit to my incredible editor, Mark Warren. There were times when I was truly ready to kill him. I mean, just kill him. In previous books, the editor would suggest things that I should change, earlier editors, and I would say, oh, of course, I would have seen it on the next draft. Makes perfect sense. Absolutely. Not Mark. Mark wanted me to change things I never in a million years would have changed and didn't think I should change, even after he told me to. But he cajoled and whimpered and insisted, and I would change them, and the impact would be just incredible. He made the book so much better than I ever would have seen my way clear to making it. So I praise him flamboyantly in the acknowledgments, and I should praise him here too. It was a remarkable experience working with him.
What's book number 7?
Oh God. Oh gosh, I don't know. I have a new puppy. Maybe I'll write about the puppy. I haven't decided. I've been watching a lot of developments in the financial world with some alarm. I will say there, just because you are all such well-informed and engaged people, 2 things I would like to put on your radar as you look going forward. The regulatory machinery that we got from Roosevelt is under judicial attack right now, to the most serious degree in its history since 1934. There's a case out of the Fifth Circuit that has been accepted for review by the Supreme Court. It's called SEC versus Jarkesy, Jarkesy. George Jarkesy is a Texas financier who was repeatedly disciplined by the SEC for allegedly violating the 33 Act, lying about what he was selling to investors. He challenged the enforcement action against him on the grounds that the use of administrative law judges by the SEC is unconstitutional and that he was entitled to a jury trial. The Fifth Circuit agreed with him. If it's not reversed by the Supreme Court, the SEC's enforcement agenda will shrink down to the size of an acorn, because it will be limited to the number of cases it can bring in the US court system with a jury trial. So that's an extremely consequential case that I am watching with bated breath. Adam Liptak, the New York Times, a Supreme Court reporter, listed it among the most important cases coming before the new Supreme Court term. A newer case that isn't quite so far along the pipeline, but well, I won't say it's even scarier, it's equally scary, is Alpine Securities versus FINRA. FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. It is the self-regulatory arm, industry supported, that regulates 90% of the Wall Street machinery that we all know. If you trade with E-Trade or you do business with Merrill Lynch, they must be members of FINRA to do business with you by law, a law passed in 1938 as part of Roosevelt's reforms. So FINRA is a direct descendant from the Maloney Act, which created the National Association of Securities Dealers, and has never been questioned constitutionally before in its life. Alpine Securities filed a suit after being multiply disciplined by FINRA and then finally expelled by FINRA. Alpine Securities sued on the grounds that FINRA itself is simply unconstitutional, lock, stock, and barrel. It won before the DC District Circuit. If that is not overturned and FINRA is found unconstitutional, a gigantic piece of our regulatory machinery falls into the ocean at one time. And the impact on the immediate impact on the financial markets, the day that decision comes down, experts say would be catastrophic. So there has been a long-running, decades-long project by conservative law firms to challenge the constitutionality of the regulatory state. And the SEC had dodged those bullets for a long time. The EPA hasn't, OSHA hasn't. They're also still under attack. But now it's the SEC's turn, and I am deeply, deeply concerned that this very pro-business, anti-regulation Supreme Court will deal a deadly blow to Roosevelt's reforms, and that unless the Congress in place when that happens is equipped to enact something to substitute, something to fill that gap, we're going to be right back in the 1920s with all the fun that entailed, but without the raccoon coats and bootleg cocktails.
I don't know. The way the world's going right now, the 1920s don't seem so bad.
Oh, read the preface to the book, Graham. They were pretty bad. They were pretty bad.
Any other questions for Diana?
Graham, I have a question.
Yep.
My question is about Joseph Kennedy.
Yeah.
And then he was obviously a controversial figure to be the SEC chairman. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about and whether you think in the end, he was the right person at that time?
That's a great and very perceptive question. Yes, it was an outrage when Roosevelt picked him to run the SEC. The New Dealers couldn't believe it. Somebody told John Flynn, who was a columnist and a staunch pro-regulatory guy, a rumor that it was going to be Joe Kennedy, and he thought that was just absolutely a lie. It could not be true. The thinking was it just that the new agency needed some breathing room. Now, look who the other contenders were. Roosevelt picked 4 people right away, and they were predictable. I mean, one was Ferdinand Pecora. He had led the Pecora hearings on Capitol Hill that had exposed all of Wall Street's sins and abuses, and it just the most humiliating experience Wall Street had ever had were the Pecora Commission. Wall Street was not a big fan of Bert Pecora. There was Jim Landis, who had helped write the 33 statute and the 34 statute and helped enforce them in his brief tenure as a commissioner on the FTC. And, Landis was perhaps the only guy that could make Pecora look acceptable to Wall Street. There were 2 Republicans. By law, there have to be two members of the minority party, but they were both mainstream progressive Republicans. There were such things in those days, and came out of a regulatory background. And both were on the FTC. One was an FTC commissioner, Bud Matthews, George Matthews, and the other was the FTC's general counsel. So we had 2 FTC Republicans and these 2 rabble-rouser guys, and Wall Street didn't want any of them to be chairman. Mm-hmm. So Ray Moley, who was a close aide to Roosevelt and had become very friendly with Joe Kennedy on the campaign trail, a little too friendly for my preferences, but he admired Joe Kennedy, stayed in touch. Kennedy was down in Florida pouting because he hadn't been tapped as Secretary of the Treasury, mm-hmm. which is what he thought he deserved given how much money he had given to the campaign. He seemed not to understand that with the Pecora hearings and the headlines every day, the last thing in the world Roosevelt could do is put a plutocrat on his cabinet. So he was pouting and didn't want to have anything to do with Roosevelt and was bad-mouthing him and telling tales. And Ray Moley reached out to him and arranged a little diplomacy. Olive branches were held out. Nice words were made. Joe Kennedy and Rose Kennedy were invited to spend a weekend in the White House. The 2 men stayed up late into the night talking. And when the bill finally got passed, Roosevelt, on Ray Moley's recommendation, offered a seat on the commission to Joe Kennedy. And it was an extremely perceptive choice. And I have to give Moley the credit for this, because he realized that it was a choice that would utterly disarm and confound Wall Street. To the rest of the country, Joe Kennedy looked like a Wall Streeter. But on Wall Street, they knew Joe Kennedy was an outsider, a guy who played a quiet hand, didn't play well with others, was extremely independent and not part of the old guard. So, he was the American citizen's idea of a Wall Streeter, and he was the Wall Street's idea of a New Dealer. So he was the perfect choice. Wall Street had to accept him. They could hardly complain about him. And yet he was committed to Roosevelt's reforms. And I should say, and I say in the book, that it was a masterpiece of public service. He was only at the SEC for a little over a year, about 431 days, according to the SEC Historical Society. And in that time, he did miracles every day and should be credited for that. Now, his later career, after he left the SEC, is just a dark storm of heartache and error and stubbornness and just just everything you say. I do cover it in the final chapters of the book, what happened to the relationship between FDR and Joe Kennedy. But this was his first public job. This was the first thing FDR ever asked him to do. And he was determined to bring honor on, as Ray Molloy put it, said, bring credit to him, to the country, to himself, and to his entire family, down to the 9th child.
Diana,
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for, again, taking time to speak with us. I'm sure we'll all go out and buy your book.
Oh, I hope so.
It sounds very, very interesting. A donation is going to be made in your honor to 100 Black Men of Indianapolis. They provide mentoring, education, and leadership development to local youth through the motto, what they see is what they'll be.
Wonderful.
Thank you again, and thank you everyone who participated. This was a very interesting club meeting today.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate
and
it.
on your next book, we want you back again.
Okay, give me a little time on that one.
Okay, and with
Thank
that,
you.
we are adjourned, everyone. Get your umbrellas out, it's raining. Bye-bye.